Perhaps one of the simplest but most interesting questions that emerges from taking in certain kinds of media is the nature of their ingredients. That is, how exactly do things arise? Why choose one kind of style over another, and one kind of design over another, and so on? As critical and interesting as the design of a machine, monster, or tool can be, so too is the canvas onto which the story takes place. That is to say, as neat as a cool Millennium Falcon, Mummy, or Proton ghost-busting pack are, where they show up also can tell us quite a bit. The locations chosen, why they are chosen, these have massive flavor and impact on the kind of story something becomes. For science fiction, the dusty barrens of Tatooine, or the verdant paradise of Pandora, the nightmarish industrial wasteland of the Matrix, or the cold sterility of Solaris' space station. All of these things are not arbitrary. So today, we are going to delve into one specific recent case study on just that, to give one example, one answer to the question: where do our imagined futures come from, and why do they take the shapes they do? In 2000, the US held a presidential election. Thanks to the whack-ass Electoral College, Al Gore, despite technically getting more votes, lost. The man he lost to was this guy, George W. Bush Jr. Bush had come in from being the 46th governor of Texas. The reason he matters is what he did during his presidency. Namely, Bush helped continue and accelerate the relaxation of US financial and housing regulations. Wow, pretty exciting stuff. During his 8 years in office, a terrible rot was growing inside the US housing market. To keep things to the point, all we need to know is that it was 1, not sustainable, and 2, because the US happens to be the world's single largest influence on global capitalism, meant that what was about to happen would have a massive impact. So, in 2007, as Bush was entering his second to last year, the rot gave out. Subprime loans and mortgages were the straw that broke the camel's back. Basically, it turns out, like most of the worst crashes, most people had a lot less money than they really thought they did. The Great Recession would smolder and burn for years afterwards. The world, and the US, that came out the other side was not the same. Income inequality rose. Average wealth per household fell. The world in the West was overall poorer and less well off than before. As well, it was more stratified into rich and poor. This is our first major stepping stone, and the starting point of our story. After this change, one of the biggest things which really shifted is one of the most direct. People without a lot of spare money tend to tighten their belts a bit on what they spend it on. Now, major stuff will, as Maslow mostly got right, stay the priority. Food, water, rent, taxes, a warm bed, and then bigger stuff like health and education, these more important things are given priority. So what gets cut? What changes? Well, the less vital stuff, namely things like tourism. You'll see a pretty major loss in the quality of life if you don't have food or, a roof over your head. Disney World, probably you can live without Disney World. But people, even during, directly after, and beyond through tough times, still want to travel at some point. Maybe the family can't afford that trip to Paris anymore, but some vacation would be neat, right? For now, hang on to that, because as we will quickly see, it's about to join up with what I will mention as the second point starting here. That being a country which you probably guessed from the intro or video title, Iceland. In the span of just a few days in 2008, pretty much the entirety of the Icelandic banking sector evaporated. Their currency dropped 80% of its value. The massive wave created by the US had swamped the tiny economy of this volcanic cold island offshore in the middle of the Atlantic. Where other countries with bigger economies were slower to careen into recession and recover, Iceland was actually small enough that it functionally was just a speck in the grand scheme of things. Then, in 2010, a volcano with a name I really can't pronounce properly exploded. If the 2008 recession was the first Big Bang, as Death Stranding put it, this was the second Big Bang. Suddenly, 2 million airplane travelers were stuck in Iceland, a country of roughly 1/3 of a million people. meaning overnight the population of the country had increased by an order of magnitude. This may cause an obvious question to arise. Why exactly would there even be 2 million people here in the first place? How could one volcano strand this many unintentional tourists? The answer is down to the geography and the second part of Iceland's role to play, where it exists. You see, the two most affluent areas on Earth, Europe and the United States, also do a massive amount of air travel. What a coincidence. However, flying huge numbers of people is all about min-maxing profits. One of the ways to do that is to take advantage of the natural airways caused by the heating and cooling of the Earth's oceans and winds. Enter the North Atlantic jet stream, a pretty consistent 3D avenue of air moving from America's east coast up and over into Europe, arcing from south to north and arriving across Ireland and into the United Kingdom. And what lies quite literally right along that path, or just next to it? The same country whose economy had just tanked 2 years previously. By the quirks of fate, itself money and geography had generated a destination for tourists with cheap local food and beds. A country of less than 500,000 people had just been injected into the awareness of the entirety of Western consciousness. And just as easy as Iceland's economy was to tank, bailing it out for the IMF was comparatively easy and direct. It was, half the population of Detroit, Michigan. Iceland was free to pivot now, and because of that easy buoyancy, resurged. It became an open source of employment, tourism. Over the next 10 years, the number of tourists and the industry meant to cater to them quite literally exploded. So this would be Big Bang number 3. As much as the volcanic activity of the mid-Atlantic ridge made the right conditions for Iceland to form, now the fault lines of money and also the same fault lines caused the volcanic explosion, and it helped create a budget holiday destination. But this doesn't really explain much on its own. Okay, so a niche country became more culturally present, thanks to some larger events. Okay, I guess they have lucky real estate. You haven't really mentioned a single science fiction thing yet. Where does film and game SF stuff fit in? Well, it's good that you asked that, as we've just arrived. All of these factors wouldn't really add up to much if Iceland, the place, wasn't what it was. As Mr. Hideo Kojima said when he was doing location scouting there 10 years ago, quote, "It seems like we are in a different planet." And that's the third secret ingredient right there. Any place used in science fiction here on Earth needs that right mix. Accessible enough to be filmable, but strange or exotic enough to a broad Western audience to seem novel or alien. Sorry, Fayetteville, Arkansas. You may be pretty, but you look like another American large town with a suburb. Iceland, on the other hand. Iceland has some insanely unique and pretty landscapes. Iceland's unique geography is what really locked it in. It's cold and treeless, but it isn't without greenery at times. The terrain can be flat in some places, but also jagged, rocky, wavy, and almost primordial feeling elsewhere. A raw landscape that captures something simple and early feeling, a kind of primeval barrenness. Take it from Ridley Scott himself. His movie Prometheus, which came out in 2012, used Iceland as its intro sequence shooting location. Scott had a team of roughly 400 for the Icelandic shooting. The reason as to why it was chosen for that white guy to do that goo thing or whatever happened in Prometheus was, as Scott put it, "Here it's so rough and Jurassic-like," and that proved decisive. Even the rest of the film, which makes use of CGI backgrounds, also had landscapes which evoke that barren, rocky essence. Because, after all, while literal locations filmed in are certainly the most direct, inspired by things from those locations can also count for sure. Interestingly enough, the Russell Crowe-helmed Noah also chose Iceland as its filming location. While not science fiction, it's more than a little likely that once again the primordial barrenness is what drew the appeal. That novelty of such a seemingly uncomplex landscape that puts its personality on display. Moving on, another prolific big-time Hollywood director, Christopher Nolan, would also make use of Iceland. First, well before the 2008 recession in his Batman Begins, with many of the frosty training sequences between Christian Bale's Batman and Liam Neeson's Ra's al Ghul taking place there. But then, for his big 2014 sci-fi film Interstellar, he would return. Multiple alien planet locations in that film were just a variety of filming locations in and around Iceland. Man's ice planet was filmed on a glacial tongue with distinctive rolling undulations. Edmund's planet at the end, as despite its desert, dry exterior, was also shot on simply a drier, rockier chunk of Iceland as well. From frozen sites to lava fields, Iceland would once again provide that killer mix of novel alien features within access of Western film crews, shaping and defining our idea of SF in the 2010s. But wait. What did you mean back there when you said Kojima was location scouting? Doesn't he make video games? Well, yes, but as you'd be obvious now with the hindsight, he was looking for something just right to inspire him terrain-wise, to be used in what else than Death Stranding, a game about reuniting America after a paranormal apocalypse has all but leveled it. Once again, that sense of primordial Earth was key. For a game about traversing over hostile terrain, Iceland provides a great baseline of environment all around. As Norman Reedus climbs, drives, and hikes over an America, which is undoubtedly just Iceland in the flesh. This one island had a great combination of towering geologic features, more benign tundras, green subarctic meadows, and so on. A great diversity of terrain to pull from as you march over it. Okay, here I do admit I lied a bit. That Hideo Kojima quote. The full thing was actually, seems like we are in a different planet. We can make Star Wars films here. Which would end up being more of a prediction, as with Rogue One in 2016, just 2 years later, it would be used for just that. The opening scene of the farmstead was indeed filmed in Iceland. Iceland also showed up as the backgrounds for several Game of Thrones shots for the TV show, as an addition to a number of smaller productions. Now the one which really threw me for a loop was actually another game, Halo Reach. This one I thought for sure must be part of the same wave, right? Only the launch of Reach was December 2010, which was only a few months after the Icelandic volcanic eruption. When you line it up fully, Reach likely started development in 2008-ish, which meant even by the time of the first trailer dropping in 2009, it was before the bulk of the wave had hit. So here, either Reach was ahead of the curve, tapping into something more games would do later, or it was just broadly Nordic-ish in its glacial level design and tundra-esque sequences, and this is just a false positive, which could also be just as much possible. Sadly, even after rewatching the bulk of the behind-the-scenes material, I couldn't confirm a single mention of Iceland explicitly. So returning to the main island itself, in this way, Iceland is a bit of a neat case example. In Prometheus, it was Earth's distant past. In Interstellar, it stood in for a number of distant planets well beyond humankind's native solar system. And in Death Stranding, it was a model for the Earth itself, after being reduced back to a primeval state for Norman Reedus and his funky fetus to reunite over. Iceland is a fascinating case of how very real-world factors like money and geography can create the conditions for fiction to take hold of and use to populate a very specific period with a very specific flavor of locale. It shows that to answer, where do our imagined features come from, you sometimes need to look at the very real present to find out. I hope you enjoyed this short look into SF. This series will be episodic and based on whatever fun SF stuff rattles around in my brain. If you like this, please consider supporting me on Patreon and, hit the bell and subscribe and the YouTube nonsense and whatever. Next time, we will be talking about a 3,000-year galactic war of conquest and its subsequent collapse into civil war.